And our moderator, delighted to have back moderating, is Diddy Coley. She's a reporter for the Boston Globe. Diddy, take it away.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I'm very sad to say that the pep talk that we just got from Secretary Howe, this might be a little bit more somber than that, but I'm excited that we're talking about this. Doug mentioned a lot of great data, but there's new numbers last week too that show it's 26 to 45-year-olds, many of them low income, middle income, who are leaving our state. And so this is the official representation for the young people of Massachusetts this morning. I'm hoping that we can just sort of start with the panelists talking about themselves. Clearly, you are the young people of Massachusetts. You have chosen to stay here, live here, work here, in some cases raise your families. Can you talk a little bit about why you think this conversation about competitiveness is even important and sort of why we should be talking about getting people to stay? Che, do you want to start?
I chose the wrong seat. Yeah, sure. So Che Anderson, living proudly in Worcester, so representing for all of the folks who are west, though Worcester is central Mass. Just want to point that out, right? For a lot of folks here, it just stops. The map just stops and halts. No, we keep going. I think the most important part of my sort of life story that I'll throw in is I'm originally from New York City, born and raised in Manhattan. I went to college in Worcester and then never left Massachusetts. Right, and I know at the time that I chose to do that, folk would look at me like a mythical creature, like, you didn't go back to Manhattan? I can't believe you stayed in this area. But for me, there was a real opportunity here as a young professional. And now, 14 years after I graduated college of Holy Cross, shout to all the Crusaders in the room, right? I know there had to be at least one of us. One of the things that I think I found is all of my 8 friends who stayed in Worcester with me, of all of us, 2 of us remain, right? 6 have left the Commonwealth, a bunch to Texas, which is really interesting. And so for those folks, there were some other priorities, and I think everyone has individual sort of life priorities and goals that they're trying to attain, and that will cause one to move or not. But for myself, I think I found a real opportunity and investment that was made in me as a young professional. And I think I'm lucky enough to be in rooms like this where I can see what opportunity is ahead. I think quite often there's a disconnect of information and opportunity for young people, and that, I think, begins the process of them eventually leaving the Commonwealth, but we'll get to more of it, I guess, later.
Yeah. Senator Sear, you represent the Cape and Islands.
Sure, and I come from the Cape and Islands, right? So my story starts, I grew up in Truro. My family, my parents actually were migrants from suburban Connecticut, moved to Provincetown in the 1970s, worked in restaurants, opened their own business, which was a very sort of common story, right, of the people who raised my generation, our generation, I think. Here, grew up, went to New York, loved living in New York for school, did a stint in D.C., and really landed back home in Massachusetts, not initially by choice, but it was the Great Recession. I graduated from college in 2008 and was back home waiting on tables and fell into working on Deval Patrick's reelection campaign, which we weren't supposed to win, and we won, and then I went to go work in state government. But really ended up coming home and running for state senate, right? One, because I just was spending so much damn time on the Cape, right? Any opportunity I had to get out of Boston and go home to Truro, to be in Provincetown, I was taking. I wanted to live there. And also because the Cape and the islands are in a predicament and have been, really long before kind of this conversation started across the state, right? But if Cape Codders and Islanders of my generation, those of us whose families have a foothold there, who are able to be there, if we're not invested in the future of the place isn't going to have a year-round economy. The place isn't going to have a year-round community. And that's very true, and the pandemic really took what was a 20-year housing crisis, put that on steroids, and now we're in the predicament where, if you don't, a household has to make $400,000 a year to afford the median home price in Truro, right? And for someone who's single and renting, it's sort of insurmountable, right? But really, I kind of came back and was really drawn to, this very special place that I was so fortunate and lucky to be born into, but with a real realization that because of inequity, because of our failure on housing, and because, quite frankly, right, we're on a little peninsula or a little island where, a lot of people want to be. We've got very limited resources. We've done a good job in preserving our fragile environment. but a real feeling that, like, look, if I'm not invested in this place, then what, was a very common experience for prior generations, that's just not going to exist, and this will be a place that's busy for 8 or 10 weeks a year with exorbitant wealthy people and all of that cultural fabric, the authenticity of the community, what makes the Outer Cape and the islands and all these different community real, vibrant places, that's just going to erode a heck of a lot faster than what's happening with rising seas and sand. So that's kind of how I got here, and really ended up running for state senate because I wanted to get an MBA, but I was very undisciplined about taking the GMAT. And when my predecessor didn't run for election, I was like, well, heck, like, I'm just going to run for this, delay this for a year. And then I got really, really lucky. But I've really been able to be engaged in this conversation, and I think in many respects, the Cape and Islands are, because of our geographic isolation, are a real sort of microcosm of sort of what's to come. And we can even see it across the region, right? So if you look at housing prices on Nantucket, there's about like a 6-year lag to Martha's Vineyard, a 7-year lag to the Outer Cape, and then onto the mainland. So I can tell you where it's going, and it ain't good.
If I grew up on the Cape, I'd never want to leave, too. So that seems right. Sam, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Secretary Howe. I feel like I want to go to a duck boat parade and I want to fight a revolution. So, I consider myself very lucky to have grown up here in Massachusetts. My family's from northern Ethiopia. I was born in Sudan, and I moved to the United States when I was 3.5. We moved to the Boston area because, like many immigrants, you go where you have people already. And so we had relatives and family friends that were already here at the time, so it made immigrating to the United States, obviously, an easier experience for my mother and for me. I grew up in Cambridge, very proud to be a Canterbridgian. I don't live in Cambridge anymore, so that's a little bit of a secret, a little off the record, but a colleague of mine promoted me from Duke of Cambridge to Earl of Middlesex, so that's where I am now. So I live in Somerville, and I went out of state for college, but I came back because this is home. The diversity in this state, the values that Secretary Howe spoke of, right? As an immigrant, as a young black man in America, there are certain states in this country where I would never go to, frankly speaking. When you talk about things like racism or anti-Semitism or Islamophobia or whatever, abortion access and all these other values that are very important to me, there are certain states in this country where I just don't feel welcome. And so being here in the Commonwealth, not saying everything's perfect here, but there's a certain sense of values that we have here that make me feel like I'm at home. The politics here lines up with my politics. The opportunities here, a lot of the things that Doug spoke about in terms of the competitiveness in our state. I also, in addition to running a consulting firm, I teach at Tufts University. Part of why I teach at Tufts, and the mother of my favorite student is here in the audience. There's Susan Ellsbury. Part of why I feel so honored to teach at Tufts is because of the deep culture of civic engagement at the university, right? I mean, every student is running something or going to run something at some point. And so, staying here for me is about values. It's about the opportunities that I've had. It's also about the family and the connections. Yes, there are days where I'm like, ooh, my rent is very high. I look every April when I'm paying my taxes, like, ooh, maybe it could be a little lower. But then I also look at the great opportunities. And yes, despite how much the MBTA frustrates me, my commute from Assembly Square to State Station is 8 minutes. It's 5 stops. I don't own a car. I don't need a car, when I think about these opportunities, there are other states that don't have transit systems at all, and so I think there's a lot here that keeps me and will probably keep me for a very long time.
Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name is Katie Lusai. I'm 30 years old, and I live in my parents' basement. With my husband, and my 2 adult brothers also live in my parents' home out in Bedford. I grew up in Bedford. It is my childhood home. I also went to college in Worcester. I went to Clark University. Thank you. Then I worked in municipal government, and then I left to go to graduate school in London. Me and my husband could have stayed in London thanks to their graduate visa programs, but we did come back to the Commonwealth because of the opportunity to start a small business, and this was where the business opportunity was. We own a natural winery. It's the only natural winery here in the Commonwealth, Mars Eye Wine. I'm here on behalf of both as a small business owner, and also I work for the town of Arlington. And I feel really strongly about the Commonwealth, both because of the business opportunity and also because of our family. We would like to start a family one day, and thinking about childcare costs in the future, and hoping to own a home one day, knew it was the most pragmatic option was to come back home. And I love my parents dearly, and they've generously built an in-law apartment, so we do have some kind of privacy. But ultimately, it was because of the opportunity, and I love the Commonwealth as well. And I do also feel a service to give back to the community as well.
You know, I think it's really telling that in just having folks introduce themselves, every single person brought up housing. I moved to Massachusetts in 2018 to attend Emerson. I would say 90% of my class no longer lives here. Part of that is natural, and part of that is people who got tired of having 5 roommates, you know, and living far away. Let's talk a little bit more about housing affordability. And Sam, I know that was a big part of your platform when you were also running for Cambridge City Council. Can you sort of talk about the way that you think about that as someone who grew up in Cambridge now?
Yeah. Thank you. I'm a big advocate of transit-oriented housing. We know statistically that people who live near mass transit are less likely to own a vehicle, or if they do that, they're less likely to even drive it to work. In Cambridge, for instance, again, my hometown, not Somerville, but Cambridge, over 60% of the residents don't drive to work. Because of restrictive zoning laws, not just in Cambridge, but throughout our Commonwealth, throughout our country for that matter, we see that there are a lot of missed opportunities, in particular in Cambridge. I mean, the history of zoning in general is exclusionary. In Cambridge, a lot of the zoning code was written a century ago by Harvard professors who didn't want poor white people from Italy and Ireland moving into Cambridge. So when you look at East Cambridge, for instance, that's where you have a lot of triple-deckers, tenement housing types. West Cambridge, Brattle Street, formerly Tory Row, if we're going back to the Revolutionary days, there you have, by law, single-family mansions that are like $10 million starting price. You know, you can't even buy a front door in Cambridge. And so for me, when we're talking about socioeconomic mobility, we have to start with housing, making sure that people have safe, stable housing, making sure that they can, that they're not cost burdened, right? We know statistically, not just in the Commonwealth, but in this country, people are cost burdened with housing. They're spending way more than a third of their gross annual salaries on gross annual income on rent. And so for me, it was about making sure that we had a greater housing stock, but also making sure that there were pathways to homeownership for those who wish to pursue homeownership. Cambridge at the time, when I ran in 2017, hadn't built an affordable home unit in about a decade. Obviously, we know in a city like Cambridge and in the greater Boston area, real estate, just the cost of the land alone is so prohibitive to even thinking about building housing, let alone affordable housing, and hence we have a lot of real estate, land banking, real estate speculation that goes on. And so for me, making sure that there is a greater affordability of housing, especially for our families. There are so many families that leave the greater Boston area, that leave Massachusetts because of an unavailability of 3-4 plus bedroom units. And then, when we think about, again, our lower income families, especially people that are on Section 8 and whatnot, yes, I'm glad that there are certain assistance programs that exist, but again, in a city like Cambridge, you have a greater chance of dying than getting a Section 8 unit because the waiting list is over 13,000 people.
Senator Sear, you live in perhaps the most expensive part of the state in many ways. And like you mentioned, I think, there's been story after story written about how it's particularly the younger workforce, the front of line workforce, people who are helping the Cape sort of run, that are dealing with housing issues. Can you talk about what you're hoping will happen there?
Sure. And for Cape Codders and Islanders, right, we are now facing the very reality in our communities that we're going to have to figure out how do we subsidize housing, not just for people of low income, but for essentially all year-round working people who don't yet own a home or are going to inherit a home, which is like an absurd concept, right? I mean, that is like you want to talk about like a really dysfunctional market that's really out of whack, right? I don't think any of us kind of envisioned wanting to have government having to step in and take a role. And we're trying to figure out how do we, pay for this, and hence, why we, want a local option transfer fee and other sort of pieces. But the reality of what our communities are trying to grapple with is really severe. And this is like the business issue on Cape Cod, because if you're in business on Cape Cod and you're any sizable business, and by sizable I mean, 5, 6, 7 or more employees, you're having to get into the business of providing housing for your workforce, which again is a rather sort of absurd thing that I don't think folks want to be doing. And this started off in our hospitality and tourism industry. My family had a seasonal restaurant for 28 years. We started to provide housing for our workforce, H-2B and J-1 visa holders. But now it's sort of extended where, the hospital on Martha's Vineyard just built a new nursing home paired with I think about 55 units for workforce housing, so they can house their employees, right? So this is really a tremendous challenge, and I think we have some real lessons from the state. And look, we got some big things done in the Affordable Homes Act. There's this seasonal communities provision in there, which is a huge deal for us, going to enable us to have year-round deed restrictions, to subsidize housing in different ways, to have creativity, year-round housing trusts. We're sort of working on that. We got to fix the revenue piece. But I think, zooming out, what I learned, especially in the last sort of 2 years, where housing now has really been on the forefront of this conversation, speaking to the Secretary talked about risks and revolution. What's going to be needed politically to solve this housing crisis is really politically difficult. And I think this is where we're going to need the business community in particular, who most of you, fortunately, are not in the situation we yet are, that we're on the Cape and the islands, right? To really sort of stomach what's needed here. And Sam really talked eloquently about how we got here, right? This isn't, actually, the Lieutenant Governor was talking on the Cape yesterday. Again, you guys have been on the Cape so much. It's pretty phenomenal and amazing. Talking about how housing is actually a problem we can solve. Right? We actually know how to do this. And the problem has been this excessive local control by 351 distinct municipalities who, frankly, have prioritized the unfettered accumulation of wealth of existing landowners and homeowners to the detriment of those who don't own, right? Those who rent. And now you're in a position, right, where you hear, at this point, I'm 38 years old. I'm almost a middle-aged person, right? You have quite successful millennials, right? I mean, on any indicator, I am considered a pretty successful person. And yet the reality for so many millennials in this state is that we're like, wait a minute, like I can't even afford to buy a house to build wealth. And by the way, we're talking about taxes, like how do you actually decrease your tax burden, owning a home, right? All those pieces. That's why people are leaving. Particularly, you look at this 25 to 44 set of professional millennials who are like, wait a minute, this is absurd. Like, I love living here. I love P-Town. I love whatever part of the Commonwealth. We love our values. But when you literally are just like, oh, I can't even tap into the American dream, and by all accounts, I am and many of us are privileged individuals, it just shows how in what a hole that we're in. But what I sort of realized in our debate around housing is we did lots of big things in the Affordable Homes Act, but broadly, this is a state-focused borrowing activity. We got to go a heck of a lot further, and taking on local control is going to be a dogfight, and I think we're going to need the real muscle that we have in this room and elsewhere to really take that on. And those fights are not pretty, but if we don't do that, we're not going to solve this housing crisis, and you'll just have more of us leaving.
In some instances, it feels like Boston or even the Cape's loss could be a gain for some of the other cities that we're seeing, or for some other parts of Massachusetts. Jay, can you talk a little bit about Worcester and seeing sort of an influx of people who might be chasing this affordability?
Yeah, I mean, I will say one of the sort of benefits that Worcester's sort of had post-pandemic in particular is you have a lot of folks that are sort of leaving Boston as a major city and coming to Worcester because of easy access to being able to get back in the area. Candidly, it would be nice to have more, to have just a lot more express trains. I took a train this morning at 5 a.m. to get here on time, so that'd be great. But I do think that what we're seeing is an influx of folk who are willing to live a little further out, right? Candidly, though, what that does is it allows for new development to come to Worcester that starts at a price that is unaffordable for the average Worcester person, right? And I think that that's the piece of it that isn't often talked about enough. So it's great having folks come from a Boston or a Cambridge into Worcester, right? Because that increases our population, which allows for some really interesting tools to be utilized later. But in the meantime, you have folks who are looking for housing that can't find it at all in the city. And so now they're leaving and going to abutting towns in Worcester County because they can't be in the city, right? And so what it does is just kind of create this trickle-down effect for some people. Conversely, I think what's been really interesting is seeing what some of the needs and interests are of folk that are coming into the community, right? So Worcester, traditionally blue-collar city, a gateway city, a large immigrant population. And so having folk that are now coming in sort of expecting larger city amenities has been really interesting, and something that we have to sort of speak to and tailor to. And to the senator's point, I think that one of the concerns that I have and something we need to really address is that there isn't enough regionality in the thinking, right? Thank you. Holy Cross, right? That's great. But truly, I think that's it, right? Like, again, coming from New York City, traveling an hour within the city isn't a big deal. For those of you that travel, you'll travel an hour somewhere. For those of you that have gone to the West Coast, you'll travel an hour for a 2-minute to a 2-mile ride in LA, right? Here, traveling 50 minutes to Worcester is like asking folks to go to New Jersey. And it's and I say it jokingly, but I'm so serious. The amount of folk, I'm sure if I did a poll in this room, there's some of you who've never been to Worcester. And it's right there, right? There's some of you who've never been to parts of the Commonwealth that are 45, 50 minutes away because you believe it's so inconvenient. It's that ideology, it's that line of thinking that limits our tools for thinking outside the box, right? And so when we think about things like housing, right, and the ability to add more opportunity, we, I'm sure, have more opportunities than you do here. But the idea of saying, well, then give us more money to do the things in that area, well, it's like, well, no, this is our wealth, and we've accumulated it here, we've amassed it here. Why would we invest outside of that area? And I think that's sort of a different line of thinking. Also, just really quickly, because we talked about looking at low-income families, I think quite often we think of folk who are low-income, and all of us get a certain image in our mind, right? Just I have to make a plug for this, being a member of the Massachusetts Cultural Council. A lot of our creatives in this community are leaving because they can't afford to be here, right? The people who got many of us through said pandemic are no longer going to be here, right? The shows we want to see, the music we want to listen to, the things that allow for us to escape for a second from whatever our everyday life is. And those folks are moving other places because we haven't been as creative as we can when it comes to providing them what they need. Right? So when we talk about housing opportunities and options, there's some really interesting tools we've seen nationally that we could implement here for our creative economy and creative class that we should be looking to as well, right? And I just want to say that because I think when we think low income, we do get in these tropes sometimes and we don't want to admit it, but people do get a certain image of certain people. And that's not just who we're talking about. There's a larger group of people and individuals who need our assistance, and we should be thinking of them as well.
I think anyone in this room, yes. Anyone in this room who hasn't been to Worcester needs to go immediately, or Che will find you. So
I will find you, yes.
You know, Katie, you're the economic development coordinator for Arlington. One of the areas in this conversation where we have always excelled is job opportunities, you know, and even now we're talking about expanding life sciences, AI, but you also run a small business. Can you talk about what we should be doing to create opportunities for all sorts of, like job-wise, all sorts of folks in Massachusetts?
Yeah, Arlington does not have a lot of life sciences. It is not our strength. And in terms of supporting small businesses, I think what we've talked about is regulation and, you know, how each local licensing authority in each municipality is so siphoned, and how they really have an opportunity to loosen those regulations a little bit and think more regionally. I say that because there's a lot of burdens on small businesses. And with each burden you have on a small business, it takes away funding from small businesses. When each bill that we get as a small business is less money that we have to give to an employee, to pay for them, to staff the markets that we do, to staff the marketing opportunities, to consult for us. I think that's such a big question. I think when it comes to increasing job opportunities for small businesses, I think I've lost track of the question because I think it's a really big one.
I think I'm curious, like when you went to open your small business in, you know, at least partly based out of the town that you grew up in. Were there certain barriers that you almost didn't expect? And can you talk about those?
So many.
And what,
So
like,
many.
What are like little things, I think, at the beginning that you think we can address before we
Oh my
get
God,
to...
absolutely. Yeah. I think the first one that we weren't necessarily expecting was needing to construct a handicap bathroom, which you may not necessarily think of when you create a space. And it's so important to make your spaces accessible. But in terms of a cost, it was going to be like an extra $10,000 for us to create an accessible bathroom. And we also didn't have the physical space to do that. So the town really did work with us to create a 1-year temporary certificate of occupancy, but we're at the end of our 1-year temporary CO, and we're going to have to shut down our tap room to the public, which really cuts down on our opportunity to bring people in to taste wine. So we're looking at different creative opportunities to have people taste wine and do pop-ups and go into different spaces. We're looking at opening up a tasting room in Cambridge, which is really exciting, but it also comes with a lot of other different costs. That one instance was such a big burden for us, but that was the first
–
initial hurdle.
And it's those small businesses a lot that I think young people in Massachusetts are looking for. I mean, you mentioned a tap room. I don't think I have to tell anyone in this room that the whole Boston is boring refrain has really gotten out of hand and
It's
comes
true.
up. It's also a little
It's
true.
true.
I also live here, but Senator Zier, you have pushed happy hour so many times.
Only
Talk
twice,
about-
guys. And we haven't even about the
I mean that as someone who is in support, but talk a little bit about that. What are some of the changes we should be looking at to sort of break out of that reputation?
No, so I think in all seriousness, we do have a bit of a fun problem here. I mean, how many people have tried to go out in Boston recently or tried to go on a date here? I see a few hands. I'm in the business of welcoming people, right? And actually, one of the best, the secretary talked about cocktail parties, right? How many of you have been to Tea Dance in Provincetown, right? One of the best cocktail parties in the world. What is it? 4 to 7 p.m. every day in high season. You go to the boat slip. There's not a discount on drinks. It's a tourist town, right? But really, right, there's all this conviviality, and I see a ton of people, right, who are coming to visit. And many of them will, fly in or come in, spend a night in Boston, and then, come out to Provincetown, right? And these are mostly queer folks, right? But what do they say? They're like, wow, you guys have nothing. This is really lame. No shade on Club Cafe, but it's still there. That's all you got. And really, I think that this is a real function, actually, as Katie was talking about, of our, over-regulation. When you look at entrepreneurship and creativity in food service, in the nightlife space, it's just incredibly difficult, right? And it's incredibly difficult to create something new and exciting and dynamic. And that's where, Shay was talking about the importance of creatives, in our communities as well, right? There's just so limited options. And so this idea around happy hour, this is a local option happy hour, so the municipality would have to adopt it. But really, I think, is just one tool, right? It's not a panacea, but really, I think, to help us be a place that is more dynamic, that there are more opportunities for folks to, to meet one another and really to have some conviviality. And I think we can, I know it's kind of fun to make trite of this, all right, here's the Millennial State Senator telling us that we're not fun, he's from P-Town, whatever. But this is a real sort of issue in sort of retaining, talent. And I think what you see here, right, we educate, I forget the exact number, but the amount of people we graduate in the state is astronomical, right? We're talking about tens of thousands of people. And so many people are leaving, and right, why are they leaving? First, I think the cost of housing. Second, then other costs, right? The cost of childcare, et cetera. But also, this just doesn't feel like a dynamic, invigorating, fun place to be. And I think if you look at the metrics, you would think that Boston is one of the hippest, coolest cities in America, right? Beautiful location, great architecture, our values, right, are the American values, right, and an inclusive, amazing, safe place. And I've yet to encounter someone who's come up to me and said, of all the visitors we have, of all the folks that I see, that we have that. And so I think we've got really work to do here in trying to figure out how do we have a lot more vibrancy. And really, I think it's the state that's getting in the way, whether it's liquor licenses, this restrictive approach, related to happy hour. I think how we can support creatives and innovation as well. Right? All that. It's just an important piece, and I think it's something that we really have to again look in a state where you have 351 distinct municipalities who have a stranglehold on housing, who I think have overregulated and put small businesses through all sorts of hoops. We've got to take a look at that, and by we I mean us in the legislature. But I think we're going to need the support of the business community. As well as I think of a lot of young people. We got to build a little bit of a coalition here of young folks to go ranting and raving for happy hour, right? But we're going to need this to push it because I think that's another barrier and a legitimate challenge that we have here.
If there's anything you can get a force of 20-year-olds to form a coalition around, I think happy hour.
I mean, happy hour, I
one.
cannot tell you how many people are like, oh my God, how did this happen? I'm like, well, it was like, I mean, honestly, this was like an idea that staffers in the Senate had, right? That we were able to convince our colleagues to support. I see Senator Feingold's here. I know he's working hard on this econ dev bill. I'm sure folks can harass the conference committee. Maybe we can get this done. But this is just part of the challenge we have. I think we have to be honest about it, and I think we have to look back to our, take some risks, right, and look at that revolutionary spirit, and do that as well in the fund business.
Sam, something to add?
Yes, just real quick. I have some thoughts and some stats to share. One, this conversation on small businesses, there are two things. One, my mentor, Steve Grossman, always tells me there are 4 C's that every small business needs: capital, connections, coaching, and capacity building. Those are 4 things that are essential for every small business, no matter your makeup, your size, your sector, whatever. Secondly, especially on the topic of access to capital, we know that that's a persistent issue for small businesses in Massachusetts. My colleagues at the Boston Foundation in 2021 put out a report looking at the racial capital access gap in Massachusetts, so specifically how much money are entrepreneurs of color missing out on, and they landed on the number $574 million every year. That's the annual racial capital access gap in Massachusetts. There are many reasons that go into that, whether that's persistent historical issues with redlining, or you happen to have a funny last name, or whatever. But that's an issue when we're looking at our private banks and other lenders. Why aren't they lending to those types of communities? The Commonwealth has made some strides, whether it's the Small Business Banking Partnership, which has a new name now, but there are other initiatives like that. I want you all to go home and Google public banking. That's something that I've worked a lot on over the last 4 to 5 years. I see John Chesto here. Thank you for giving me a boost over the past few years, and we were able to get the Boston Globe to endorse this effort. I know Secretary Howe's an expert in alternative financing models, so that's something to look at. The other thing, I am probably on this side of Newton, the biggest fan of Che Anderson. And I will say, Worcester is a beautiful place. I've gone many times, and actually he is one of my Worcester plugs, so I want to say that. But the other thing that I just want to say is the Boston Chamber of Commerce put out a report looking at the young residents in 2023. They had a survey. There's some interesting stats in here. So 48% of young residents said that it was easy to build community in Boston, while 22% said it was difficult. Now, Senator Sear mentions LGBT individuals. So our queer community, interestingly, 32% are more likely to find difficulty in building community in Boston. That's interesting. 37% of our young residents said it was easy to build community due to entertainment options, while 32% said that it was difficult to build community. And then factors, obviously, that are detrimental in this sense of nightlife are happy hour ban, the 2 a.m. curfew, which I think is a residual result of our Puritan roots here in Massachusetts, and then obviously the fact that the MBTA literally needs to shut down for maintenance. But interestingly, when you look at this report, in the top 11 issues that young residents mentioned, they did not bring up childcare. And I would theorize that that's probably because we know millennials are having children at less rate than other people are. So that's something. And I just want to highlight Michael Bobbitt's in the room. So if you want to learn more about the cultural economy in Massachusetts, which is on par with retail and higher than construction, you should talk to him and learn more about what Mass Cultural Council is doing.
I was going to say, Che, I know you want to add something. Can you wrap into that? I want to end this with asking all of the panelists that when you are inevitably at the cocktail party, at the bar, at wherever where young people are telling you that they, are thinking about leaving, give us your elevator pitch as to why they shouldn't and why you're not.
So the one thing I was going to say really quickly was the curfew, I think, is always a really interesting conversation for us, like the 2 a.m. curfew, because most other cities that we're competing with have 2 a.m. curfews. Like, there are only a few cities where you're open till 3, 4 a.m., right? It's not about the fact that we close at 2. It's that people don't feel like you get the most proverbial bang for your buck until 2, right? I've been in other cities with a 2 a.m. curfew, and by 1:50, I'm like, I'm done. Like, I need to go home, right? But I feel like quite often a night out where you're going out to your traditional sort of sports bar or pub or something, yeah, you can still do something at 2 a.m. Like, you want to go out, you want to move, you want something exciting. And so I think it's that. And the fact that if you're out to that late, you're taking an Uber or a taxi home. Yep. And I think that's a thing we have to throw into this conversation, right? If I come into Boston for a sporting event, I was saying out as a joke, I have to hope the Celtics or Bruins never go to overtime. Because if they do, I'm getting home at 1:30 in the morning on that train back to Worcester. And that is something we need to discuss, let alone those of you that are going throughout the city. But when people do say, I'm going to leave, I'm going to go to North Carolina or Texas or something, I go, I want to visit because it's warm. And then I say, I think similar to what folks were saying earlier, right? At the end of the day, I believe that everyone up here is a successful young professional. Right, we have different sort of metrics for what that is, but I'm going to get some wine from you. But in different ways, we all have our thing. And so I believe that if we wanted to, we could live somewhere else. I think that we're the kind of people that people recruit to other places, right? We're here because we see something in the Commonwealth or in our city or town where it is that we live, right? We believe in our government infrastructure. We believe in our leaders to lead us in the right direction. And candidly, we understand the process and have access to go to them and take them to task if we think something is incorrect, right? I think that that's a big piece of why this Commonwealth works, right? We have people who are willing to listen. We have people who are willing to do the difficult things at times and have been since the beginning of this state. I just think that sometimes we as young professionals have to find ways to build coalition and push for the things that we specifically want. Because I don't think there's I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the age gap that's leaving. Right? I think that this is an age where you're trying to find yourself, where you're trying to figure out what's next, where you're building partnerships and community and family. And in that time, sometimes it's easier to just pick up and go than it is to figure out whatever the fight is here. Like, why should I have to fight? I just want to go somewhere that's going to give it to me. But I think that we have a generation and generations behind us who are willing to sort of fight and to build. And if that's what it comes to, that's what we're going to do. And so I think that's a big part of that pitch. And sometimes it works, and sometimes I just have a warm place to visit. So there's that.
Amazing. Okay, elevator pitches. Katie, you want to go next?
Yeah, I definitely think the next generation is figuring out where to find those third spaces and where to find those spaces to build community. We live in the Commonwealth because there is that opportunity to build our businesses, to find employees, and to find those opportunities for career growth, to build our families, to find those opportunities to have our shared values. We have a phenomenal cultural economy. We have the restaurants. We have the environment. We have our green spaces that we love. We have everything here in Massachusetts, why people stay, and we don't always have that in other parts of the country. We have high incomes. In London, it was wonderful, but the salaries were so much lower and the cost of living was just as high, which is partially why we moved back. We could not sustain that cost of living with such low salaries. But here, the salaries were matched to sustain the high cost of living, and we got the same amenities. In addition, we still had our family. And people still are seeking the same, and we have the great world-class institutions and businesses and organizations.
Amazing. Sam, you want to go next?
Quite frankly, Massachusetts invented the United States. That's, although my tour guide in Philadelphia earlier this year, we had a friendly understanding that Massachusetts invented the revolution and Pennsylvania legalized it. And so we've come to that understanding, So that's okay. I'm okay with that. We're not going to go to war. But I would say, there are several things that really keep me and should keep other people in Massachusetts. Governor Patrick would always say within 90 miles of the city of Boston, there are over 300 institutions of higher learning. I mean, we are the intellectual capital hub of this country. We're the clean energy hub of this country. We're the life sciences hub of this country. We have transit systems, 15 other systems in Massachusetts outside of the MBTA. They exist. They don't always work, but they exist. we have opportunities here for growth. It's evident there are people from around the world who come here, whether it is to get a degree or to get some extra years on their resume. People come here to learn, to grow. Now we want them to come here to build a family. And for that to happen, we need to be building more housing. We need to be investing more in lowering these costs to exist in Massachusetts. So I think there are many reasons why people come here, and we're already great, but there are definitely opportunities for us to become extraordinary, and I'm looking forward to seeing what those are.
Amazing. All right, Senator, you're the last one. This is the big pitch.
The big pitch. There's so much that we're doing right in this state, right? I mean, come on. I mean, look at what we've done with education, with healthcare. By the way, these investments cost money, right? But so much that we're doing right here. And I have actually not encountered a single person, and I know a number of people who are leaving the state, have left the state, or tell me they're leaving. It's very begrudging, right, that they're leaving. They're not being like, I'm fed up with this place, screw Massachusetts. It's very much of like, wow, like, I can't make it here. Like, I don't know what I'm going to do. My landlord decides to sell my rental, like in P-Town, like, that's it, I got to leave, right? We're leaving Massachusetts not because we really want to, right, but because we're looking at the dollars and cents of it, and it's not adding up for our lives and being able to build wealth for whatever your family looks like. And so I think that's what's really key here. And I think, too often, I think in the state, we've really kind of prioritized and done right on the morality of issues, but often we don't get the equity piece right. And we're now seeing that I think our failure in equity is bleeding not just for those, who traditionally have been left out, but really into our whole younger generations, right? And so this is where the work really lies. And so, my pitch on this is we're doing so much right, and we're really talking about it. And I think the challenge ahead in the next several years, in the next administration, in the next legislative session, not next administration, is really doing the hard and necessary work that's going to shift this. And politically, it's really difficult because the way that this revolutionary state was created, right, is through our directest and most direct democracies, right, in our town meetings and our small towns. And I think having to figure that out is really the challenge that's ahead of us. But this is a place where people want to live and they want to be. They're just quite frankly getting forced out, and I'm really encouraged actually that all of us are talking about that, and hopefully that is going to lead to, I know that's going to lead to some big changes and taking some big risks and doing some more revolutionary stuff. So thank you so much for having us.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists.
Thank you so